we're going to move into the first session where we're going to hear from Ralph Bragg, who is the CEO and CTO of Radium. He also used to be the ecosystem and trust framework architect for the OBIE, and he's a digital identity specialist. This session is going to be moderated by Jamie Leach. Jamie Leach is the domain lead, regulated data at Cascal. Formerly, she was the regional director in APAC for F-Data, and she has worked for the Open Data Institute, and she's the founder of Open Data Australia. So I will hand over to Ralph.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for having me, and it's a very real pleasure to be here. I have prepared a few slides, if that's all right, Camilla, to just quickly aid this discussion. So I'm just going to quickly do a screen share. Excellent. Thanks very much, and thank you very much for the kind or the introduction. It really did help set the scene. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ecosystems that Radium has been involved in. As Camilla has just said, I was the trust framework and ecosystem architect for the UK open banking implementation entity, but Radium has been involved in building ecosystems now for the better part of 6 years, and we've been actively involved with the Australian Banking Association, helping them chart the course towards the future evolution of the consumer data right. We've worked for the Brazilian open banking program, where we run their central trust infrastructure, as well as providing editorial and consulting services to help create the Brazilian standards. We also now work for SUSEP, which is the open insurance regulator, as part of Brazil's foray into open insurance. And all of these different markets that we've been involved with have all got the same sort of key principles. They need to be accessible, scalable, and interoperable. And those core principles that we're trying to achieve are really part of the same core functions of the greatest and largest ecosystem of them all, the internet. So all of these ecosystems do really need to make sure that they adhere and hit those three main sort of goals. So in order for them to be accessible, we really need to be using global standards and well-defined local functional API standards wherever possible. They need to be conformant and certified so that they actually work. And they need to be familiar, well supported, and standardized so that when you come along and try and use these different ecosystems, they just function. There's no problems. There's no issues with connectivity like there was with the browser wars of the early 1990s, where we all remember where certain websites work better with Netscape Communicator and other websites work better with Internet Explorer. So standards are really required for security and function. And there are several ways that we've seen these programs evolve. And if we come back to the original implementation of the UK OBIE, the very first implementation of the open banking standard resulted in 12 distinct implementations. Open banking at the very, very start was not a consistent, homogeneous implementation. And the reason I say it was 12 might be surprising to quite a few people, because there was only 9 major banks that were compelled to deliver a consistent major standard. But even within those individual banks, they had different divisions, different technology sets. You had private banking, retail banking, some based in different locations around the world, and even they couldn't agree and actually implement a consistent standard. And so what you can see is you can either end up with one of these three options. You can either end up with every bank delivering a standard, but it's not broadly interoperable because everyone has misinterpreted the standard or reinterpreted the standard as they see fit. Some markets go down the aggregator. Somebody sticks themselves in the middle and acts as an ultimate middleman that tries to provide a consistent API for everyone and tries to abstract these different implementations of standards away. And then on the right-hand side, you have what is the target state, that panacea, where every single provider of APIs delivers a consistent, homogeneous standard, which really delivers those economic benefits that we just talked about. But standards alone aren't just going to get us to that target state. Every single successful ecosystem has enablers. And those enablers really are the key points that drive through successful ecosystems. They include reference implementations that can be used as a litmus test, and also to be something to throw rocks at by the ecosystem to say, this is what we think the standard should mean. And they also include a very, very strong testing and certification process and governance process that means that you can drive through, or you actually can realize those benefits by driving through to that consistent ecosystem. Every single ecosystem that we worked on starts with the same major building blocks. You've got a regulator and a controller. You've got somebody that's got some data, and you've got somebody that would like access to that data in order to bring those propositions to market. And in all of the major successful ecosystems, the following additional services are provided, usually by the controller or regulator, in order to make sure that you end up with all of the benefits that an open ecosystem can provide. And they include a strong conformance suite for data providers, a strong conformance suite for relying parties, but also a trust platform or directory that pulls together all of the different services needed to build an ecosystem. And that trust platform directory is primarily a set of services that is geared towards the controller and regulator, but it is used by both parties in order to solve some of the challenges that exist at the core of each of these digital ecosystems. And so if we look at the 3 different case studies, they all have a very, very similar story. Service providers wish to consume data from data providers. Data providers have got to solve some challenges to firstly identify service providers. The ecosystem controller is really trying to make sure that costs and governance are followed by all members of this ecosystem, and are really the ones that are responsible for trying to drive through those market outcomes. So you've really got 3 core actors within an ecosystem. The trust platforms / ecosystem controller, sometimes which can be a regulatory body, or it can be a body that is set up like the UK OBIE on behalf of a regulatory body. You've got data providers, usually banks, and you've got service providers that are trying to consume those data. And all 3 of them have a key and critical role to play. And if you can go and get each of those providers to actively engage with each other to provide the necessary functions and services that each other's needs, then you can see real-world ecosystems evolve. And in all of the major ecosystems around the world, these services and this 3-party model has started to really start to function. But if we look at the the case study between the UK, Brazil banking and Brazil insurance, you can see that it starts getting faster. So in the UK, we had to design all of these services, all of these trust frameworks, all of this directory, all of the necessary underlying standards from scratch. We were all starting with a blank sheet of paper. And it took about 6 years to go and get the UK into a state that it currently is today. In contrast, we were able to do the same thing for Brazil's open banking in about 6 months. And then again, for the Brazil insurance industry, we were able to do that in about 6 weeks. I'm going to start with the summary slide now as to how we were able to do that using open standards and using tried and true patterns. But these are the 3 core challenges that every single ecosystem is trying to deal with. And these are the main reasons why they are now faster and cheaper to implement. Tackling the who of who you are dealing with in a digital distributed ecosystem is usually 60% of the challenge. Working out who is allowed to engage in this ecosystem. How do you identify them? How do you authorize them? How do you know that they're allowed to engage in this market? Well, in the UK, banks had to work with their vendors to design and implement the standards and the trust framework. There wasn't anything. There was literally a blank sheet of paper. And Radium at the OBIE had to design all of the trust framework and supporting services for the UK OBIE from nothing. When Brazil came along, banks and their vendors were ready to go. And I think it's a key point here is that when we're talking to 2 banks, we have to recognize that a large amount of what the work that we're proposing these banks need to do won't actually be done by the banks. They'll be done by banks' vendors. And so being able to make sure that the banks are supported by their own technology and providers was a real big win in the UK. But we still had to tackle all of that from scratch. The second part of it is deciding how do you communicate? Well, that was 30% of the challenge. And again, UK banks had to work with their vendors to design and implement this. FAPI didn't exist. There wasn't widespread adoption of OpenID Connect for financial grade APIs. There was a significant barrier to achieving the necessary security bar in order for banks to be comfortable to sharing their data. But again, by the time Brazil rolled around, banks and their vendors were ready to go with modifications. And finally, you get to the what. What are you allowed or required to share? And this is the small part. This is the easy part. is about 10% of the overall challenge is building functional APIs. If you have a solid basis for security, consent, authorization, you know who you're dealing with, and you're capable of, everybody is capable of proving those interactions, then building and accelerating and building a plethora of API propositions and API services is very, very simple. It's also one of the areas that's always going to need to have a local flavor. For example, in Australia, you've got a BSB. In the UK, you've got a sort code and account number, and little things that are different between functional jurisdictions. They're easy to work around, but there are always little differences between what makes up mandatory fields on an account record or a transaction record or a payment record. In addition to standards, testing and certification, I can't bang on about this enough. In each of the major ecosystems, an ecosystem controller or regulator has provided and invested in comprehensive testing and accreditation services for both parties, both the providers and the consumers. And as the successful ones, they've mandated the use of and certification of the software and services on an ongoing basis. Certification is not just a one and done, just in the same way as APIs are not just a one and done. They constantly evolve, they constantly change, and it requires continuous investment to make this digital economy a reality. The key takeaway for conformance and certification, though, is that you definitely need to require testing in production. Pre-production testing is demonstrably insufficient. In every single market that we've been involved in, we've seen everybody go through the same sort of approach. I don't want to test in production because my production systems are my production systems, and I don't have test accounts in production. So I'm going to require certification in my sandbox systems, and I'll write a letter and I'll sign a document to say that my sandbox systems are exactly the same as production. And then it doesn't work. And that is always the case. And every single market, we're now going through the same process in Brazil. There are always challenges, just little differences, but they're enough to make interoperability testing challenging in UAT. The other thing about a good and solid testing and certification process and testing framework is that any participant should be able to use the testing and certification framework to be able to test any other system's compliance to the standards. If the testing and certification processes are open and available for everyone to use, and you're just acting as a participant, any other participant will be able to prove the compliance or non-compliance of any other participant. And that is an incredibly powerful tool to be able to enable an ecosystem to self-certify, to be able to call each other to account. It also acts as a great means for regulators to be able to simplify their lives, to say whenever any disputes arise, because they can simply turn to one bank who's made an allegation of non-compliance against another bank and say, you've got the tools, prove it. Give me a certified test run that shows that that bank is non-compliant, and I'll do something about it. And what that does is it starts ironing out a lot of the different challenges when it comes to those issues that inevitably always arise. So I'm pretty sure I'm out of time. Key takeaways for me are always going to be: don't reinvent the wheel. Use proven international security and authorization standards. That's the reason why these ecosystems are now faster and cheaper to implement, and they're a lot faster and cheaper to implement. A lot of people get quite spooked about the amount of money that the OBIE has spent building open banking in the UK. Well, Brazil, it's a fraction of that because they're not reinventing the wheel. They have the capabilities that's delivered turnkey to them to enable them to deliver their ecosystem, which means that they can concentrate on what they're delivering, not how they're delivering it, not how they're securing it. And for the most part, they're broadly compatible with both the Australian ecosystem, but also the UK. And the ecosystem controller or regulator has a really big role. Most successful ecosystems that we've seen emerge, where we've seen the regulator really lean in, that they recognize that they have a role to play to make sure that this ecosystem functions, and that they have the capability to reduce significantly the costs associated at a macroeconomic level by solving some of these core challenges. Provide a simple means for businesses to prove that they are allowed to engage in this ecosystem. Provide a means for these businesses to prove what they're allowed to do in this ecosystem. Solve discovery for your participants. Make it easy for them to find out who is in your ecosystem, and then solve quality and consistency of service for participants. In the UK, you ended up with we were better than Europe. In Europe, you ended up with the rise of a lot of intermediaries and a lot of middlemen that were responsible for solving some of these problems that a lack of standardization and a lack of consistency resulted in. In the UK, you can engage with open banking with the 9 biggest banks, pretty much with a library. In Brazil, you can do it with 260 lines of Node.js, public, free, open source libraries that give you access to the entire financial services market. And that's the objective that we're trying to create.
Thanks very much, Ralph. That was amazing. I think you've already answered the 5 questions that I was going to ask on behalf of the workshop, but just looking at time, I would like to pose one question. Obviously, not every regulator in the world has access to yourself. Well, they could if they wanted to, but right now you're probably not working for all of them. So if you were going to leave them with one tip of where to start to create true interoperability, you know, we have global brands, we have global trade, we have consumers that literally have services across multiple jurisdictions. What would you think is the most valuable starting place for regulators to try to create that interoperability?
Cool. Start with the hard ones. Don't tackle security yourselves. Delegate the creation of appropriate standards to appropriate standards bodies. Allow banks and allow your ecosystem to concentrate on what you need to do, and allow the industry and allow other standards bodies to help you solve the other challenges. The OpenID Foundation has been brilliant and is a continuous source of the evolution and continuous improvements in terms of how you secure and share data.
That is fantastic. Now, Ralph, you had some amazing slides there. I don't know if you're willing to share them with the workshop, but obviously if you are, if you could send them to Camilla, and I personally would love to get a copy of, you know, those first few that you put out there. I think they're really, really just easy to follow tips on how to get started. But please, everybody, join me in thanking Ralph for his time today.